Session 4 is now beginning, so this is a session on new guidance, standards and the evolving role of the regulator. And I'd like to welcome Rob Ivens from Mole Valley District Council and Rachel Thomas from Pembrokeshire County Council to the stage.
Thank you very much for inviting us to speak. Rachel and I, it feels a bit like a blind date. We've not met before, so we've only introduced each other.
About 2 minutes ago, so...
So I'm Rob Ivens, Mole Valley.
I'm Rachel Thomas from Pembrokeshire. If anyone doesn't know where it is, keep going on the M4, right to the very end, and it's probably another hour. So, yeah, it's quite a long way away.
Right. So, just a bit of introduction. I said I'd do the introduction because I got the daft title, Guidance and why we don't use it or haven't got it. Well, the reason is that I'm a small local authority, £21 million budget. We used to get £5 million from the government. We lost that a few years ago. We can keep council tax, that's £3 million, but we're quite rich, so we're going to be giving that away in 3 or 4 years' time. So I think that's about £7 million that we've lost on our budget. SCC lost £50 million. Right, so what you might say is bleating. Well, there's no money for training, really. There's not much training available. I mean, industries, government used to provide it. I come from a generation where we met Mary Harris and Judith Lowe, and they wrote a lot of the guidance, and they trained us. So who's training us now? LA's often, I mean, how much did it cost you to come from Pembrokeshire to London?
It's actually, no, their train was quite cheap.
It was cheap.
It's a long time.
It can be a small fortune. So even the train fare can be dear for most of us. You know, when you go to your boss and say, can we have £120 for the latest Syria publication, which, as we've already said, we're probably going to lose, he does wonder why we're spending the money. Right.
Yeah, okay. I just thought most of the talks don't really focus on Wales, and we are trying to change things in Wales. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an update on what's happening in Wales. A lot of things are similar in Wales to England, as in we're losing a lot of our budgets. And in that respect, when CLOs leave, they're probably not being replaced. Most of the authorities now don't have a dedicated officer, unfortunately. In Pembrokeshire, we're lucky that I am, but I also provide support to a couple of local authorities when they need help. I'm also chair. Wales has what we call the National Land Contamination Working Group. It's made up of local authority representation, Natural Resources Wales, Welsh Government, and Public Health Wales. Our aim is to make sure that CLOs in Wales are up to date with everything. We try and keep us up to date. We offer training normally once a year, and Welsh Government are very kind in giving us a little bit of money for that. So we obviously have to be careful of how much we spend that. Getting talks in from industry is very handy to keep us up to date on things. And also we try and produce some guidance for our colleagues that don't necessarily do it day to day. We have, I don't know how many of you do work in Wales, we have what we call the Developer's Guide. It's essentially a bit of a guide for any developer, but also for the consultants. What we expect out of it, just basically reminding everyone of CLR 11. But at the back is a bunch of really useful checklists, what to include in desk studies, site investigation, and your remediation strategies, verification reports. These are particularly useful for us or for our colleagues that don't normally deal with it day to day, because as a consultant, we'd quite like you to make sure that everything's ticked. That would save us a lot of time through planning. So yeah, it's a bit of guidance. We do quite a lot of other work. We're trying to really kind of keep everything, just making sure we know everything. Basically, it's just another way of working in this tight budget we are at.
Yeah, up there.
Yeah, I'm just going to introduce a little bit of Welsh Government I've introduced. It came actually last year, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. probably not heard of it, but it's quite big in the public bodies. We've been told we need to be sustainable for the future, and anything we do needs to reflect this. I see it as a good thing for consultants, to be honest, because a lot of times, I know I used to come from consultancy. We used to argue with the developer of why we were doing stuff. We want to be sustainable as an industry. I think it'd be good for you as well to just kind of point your clients in the way that, you know, in Wales, we want to be sustainable. They've got this act that we need to meet. So it might well help you in just pushing your sustainable remediation ideas, I think, hopefully. Okay, and just going to tie that in with, I say we have, the national group have been quite good with Welsh Government. The Welsh Government are very supportive of us. Our Environment Minister is very supportive. We haven't had Part 2A funding since 2011 in Wales. This year they gave us £1 million across Wales to start dealing with it, as long as we tied in with the Wellbeing Act I've just mentioned. So not every authority has managed to bid for the money. In Pembrokeshire, we were quite lucky. We've got 2 sites we're going to investigate. But they were based on the fact that we were going to bring derelict land back into use for public spaces. One's public spaces, the other one's to deal with blight issues. We can't sell the land because of the potential of it being Part 2A. So it's going to be, if they don't sell land, it's quite complicated. The company are looking to move out of Pembrokeshire, so employment issues arise with that. So that's part of the Future Act as well. It's like to keep employment in Wales. So they've finally given us some money so we can come to closure with that, which is quite good. We do a lot of our risk assessments via desk space, just because if we haven't got the money. And basically, I think, well, and the desk-based stuff, we have a lot of information coming in. We have a lot of questions from solicitors when they have their property sales searches coming in, basically saying, where is it on your prioritisation? Are you going to investigate it? So that's why it's a driver for us to keep that information up to date. But a lot of times, that's where we need your help, really.
Okay. Straw poll. If we're remediating in planning, anyone know the standard that we're meant to remediate to? I was careful in how I worded this because I think Judith might be in. Any ideas? Anyone want to volunteer an answer? Paragraph 120 says unacceptable risks, prevention of unacceptable risks. It talks about being suitable in para 121. But then goes on to talk about avoidance of Part 2A. So that's the most important piece of guidance that I like to bear in mind. Is there anything I think might be unacceptable? The statutory guidance then talks about, is there a reasonable possibility for a significant contaminated land linkage, contamination linkage, contaminant linkage? I've given up asking for site investigations on flats in the centre of our town. It's just, there's nothing there, and there's all concrete.
Oh, yeah. Just to... Planning in Wales, our planners don't like you quoting NPPF in Wales because we've got our own planning policy. So just, you know, if you're submitting something to us or our planners, they get a bit tetchy. So just make sure you are quoting the right things. And when you talk about, if you've had any consultation, make sure it says NRW and not EO. As well, we work very closely with NRW, so it's quite important. And also in Wales, it's not quite the same I understand in England. We have Welsh Government issue model planning conditions relating to contaminated land. You've probably seen a variety of conditions over your time as developers have come to you. I would urge that you contact us. Welsh Government ones are, most of the authorities in Wales have adopted them. They're very wordy and not necessarily easy to discharge all in one go. They generally combine all phases into one condition. We are working with Welsh Government and looking at reviewing them at the moment as part of the national group, but I would suggest that you contact us if you get a developer coming in, because the number of times I've had arguments with developers recently about the planning conditions, it just gets long-winded. Quite often, the condition will say you need to do a site investigation, and we well know that you don't need to do a site investigation. A desk study might suffice. So if you just ring up and say, we're going to do a desk study, we'll let you know the results of that, we're normally happy. But if someone just gives me a desk study and says this is going to meet the condition, the planners and ourselves, good first communication is highly important in just getting things moving easy.
Yeah, touchy. So the standard of the decision. So just staying with really high level guidance. I know you were here for technical stuff, but so now we've gone from the MPPF to the statutory guidance on the contaminated land, which actually says you'll deal with as much as you can through planning. And it also says you'll be scientific and authoritative, which brings us nicely back to the discussion of the P20 input parameters and things like that we were just discussing at the workshop. So there's a reason for this, and I'll come back to it later. Right, guidance. We were here to talk about guidance. I can't understand all that. I can't even begin to imagine how to deploy most of that on a sensible site. That's the gas guidance from Sarah Mortimer, current for both bulk and VOC gases. So if you like, I had several discussions with people about how do you communicate guidance and the value of guidance. I think the big value of guidance is knowing your own way around them in a comfortable manner, that you can actually demonstrate the point that you need to yourself and the client and your bosses in order to get the case understood. Because at the end of the day, we're in a triangle here. There's us, the regulator, there's you, the consultants, and at the top of the power heap is the man with the money. And if we don't explain to him clearly what needs to be done, then he won't release the money. So here's an example of a site, and I'm going to drop Rachel in here. So this site came to me, and I'm going to ask her what she sees. The development site is the green star, and the petrol station is the red star. And then this is interesting. We were all here this morning. This is the first map I ever go to, the 1954 thereabouts Ordnance Survey map in Mole Valley. In most places, it's brilliant because it's the 1948 Planning Act that locked everything down, and then the land started to get reused. So I immediately go to that, which isn't in the site investigation, and what do you see, Rachel? Tell us what you see. What looks interesting?
No impressive. You've got a big works there, you've got a laundry, so that ties in with our TCE. Another old petrol station. Post offices also used to have their own underground fuel tanks as well. Yeah,
that's about right. I missed the laundry. I went, works! Works! Chlorinated solvents. Yeah, brilliant, exactly. So what happened? The consultant came along and we had a chat. And I suppose what we wanted to say is that we all have to respect each other, really. So forgive me if I've been a bit facetious. So the consultant said, blah, 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 everything's below S4UL. I said, what about this trimethyl benzene stuff? I mean, I was playing it a bit thick. I did know it, but I didn't actually know what it was. I just know anything with a zine on it or a chloro on it is bad. So I don't need guidance to know this is bad. Actually, Wikipedia told me it's dry cleaning stuff. I thought, oh, that's great. But I didn't look up that at the time. And they said, we need to consider the garage. I said, what about the VOCs? The garage needs to be considered. What about the vinyl chloride? Because I know from some time ago, from a much more knowledgeable colleague of mine, that everything that's chlorinated solvents ends up at vinyl chloride. So if you have any vinyl chloride, you might have a problem. And there's vinyl chloride here. So I didn't need guidance to know that. We think it's lateral migration from the garage. Oh, for God's sake! What about the vinyl chloride? That isn't from the garage. The clear model shows there isn't a problem. I don't care about clear, I don't trust it. The garage needs to be considered. Have you seen the works? The garage needs... What about those square things? There were some square things. I think they might be tanks. Blah, blah, blah. I'm not listening now. Blah, 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 blah. Rang Richard. He said, oh, what about the dry cleaners? A bit worried about that. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, to hell with it. You need to get an expert. Why do they need to get an expert? Because the statutory guidance says you have to be scientific and authoritative. Basically, I was quite concerned and I wasn't being listened to. Anyway, the results. Yeah, what we got? DCE, 2,359 versus a screening level of 21. Hey-ho. The serious bit is I can't read that guidance. I can't understand. I can read it, but I can't understand how to deploy it. So long-windedly, and this would be my tip, I guess, to any consultant, is if you've got the regulator in a difficult place and there are things that you don't like but maybe make sense, and you think it might be slightly over your pay grade, can we just agree to get someone in? So this was Steve and Sarah's conceptual model. And yes, the tanks are still on there, but actually there's this. You see, I know in Leatherhead that you get shallow clay, less than a metre. Those results I showed you were within a metre of the building footprint, and the building was going over as resi. So that's my rant over.
Yeah, we've heard a lot last day and a bit about the CSM. We are, in my experience, we're a little bit overlooked when it comes to your CSMs. We hold, well, in Pembrokeshire especially, and I know in other councils, Wales and probably yourselves, we hold an excessive amount of data because everything that comes in, we see. Everything that comes through planning is recorded by us. We have site investigation reports, maybe for your site, maybe for adjacent sites. We have records of disused fuel tanks. And also, when solicitor searches come in, we often record if they've flagged something up that we don't have on our database, we record that. So things that we haven't even picked up, we're recording. We have a wealth of knowledge in GIS and in paper and hard copy. I mean, paper, hard copy, electronic format. So just ask. I mean, pick up the phone, send us an email. We will try and help where we can.
We've given up charging you mostly because it's better to get... sorry, I speak for myself, but I'd rather just give you a spreadsheet of the planning history, really. I'd just give it to you. We haven't got all the fiches, but... I
mean, our bosses in this time of, cuts would probably like us to charge to collate the data for you, but to be honest, if it's going to help you and it's going to help everyone in the long run, most of us are more willing just to go and get that data or to give us a call. I mean, for example, in Pembrokeshire, you might think it's quite rural, but we've got 5,000 sites on our potentially contaminated land list, plus a load of extra data. So there is a lot out there that I'm sure would benefit you from the historical point of view as well.
And I added this to Rachel's slide. We've got quite a lot of experience of asking difficult questions. It's actually what we're paid to do. We're not paid to service a client. We're actually paid to be awkward. And so if we are being awkward, it's not because I want to be awkward, it's because I'm actually a bit worried. And other people, and I'm old and not quite senile yet, but other people may not be quite so robust with their awkward questions. So try and please be nice when awkward questions come up and don't try and flannel everybody. So why might we bother about small exceedences? Just some chemicals are quite nasty. You can't just say it. It's not just simply an arithmetic exercise. I mean, I was talking to Richard Brinkworth this morning, and he was saying, conceptual models came up a lot. Unless we understand the model of the site, unless we understand that we've done a good investigation, we'll get onto that in a bit, then actually we can't just say everything's fine. We can't just say let's remove the hotspots because we don't actually understand the context. So what always is interesting to me is whether or not you're doing representative sampling and what are the constraints. There is a nice guidance document that talks about you can't really do a site investigation that is constrained. So I counted last night, 5930 talks about representative 52 times, constraints 26 times, BS 101175, a little bit more useful. It seems to have wound it back a bit. It's a bit more specific. It's a bit more tells you what to do. I like 10175. I like the one on the right. I was struggling. I was reading. They both, Mike can probably tell us the difference between the two, but I was struggling to find what I needed in 930 because I was looking for grid spacing, and it's in 101175, how much investigation to do. So how adequate is your non-targeted sampling? Really good idea to think about that. And no one ever gets paid for an argument. You don't get paid for an argument. I actually suffer from an argument because it causes damage to my relationship with you, and it runs the risk of embarrassing you to your client. And that's all bad news. So my tip is, if you can agree the areas of uncertainty, then for goodness sake, somehow, with the planning authority and the EH department, work out how to move on to the next report where everybody can get paid. Let's not fight over a report that might not be clear. And let's find the stuff in the guidance, the technical guidance, because we're concerned, that enables us to move on. Right, so, I suppose an idea about reporting. Flag the unusual, that's all I do. I just go to the back and look at the funny bits. I immediately go to the chlorinated solvents because I'm always concerned about them if I've seen the words works. And you heard this morning why you should be concerned, because I used to work in factories. I don't know whether anyone else has. But if you're old enough to work in a factory, you know they tipped a lot of stuff out the doors. So, you know, that's my experience. You heard this morning the intellectual experience about why 1950s, 1960s factories are bad news. They clean bits of metal and they join them together and they cover them in paint. To do that, you have to have solvents. So if you find these bits and pieces on a site, flag it. Don't try and get rid of it. On most sites, I absolutely trust you to just over-engineer everything away. It will go away. I don't care. But there are some things I am interested in. Cadmium and mercury, they don't come up very often. If they come up, there's usually a reason. Asbestos, fibrous asbestos, lagging. There are these sort of lists of contaminants that are a bit concerning. And I think, you know, it would do well to actually have those contaminants of concern and screen them in and think about them. So then, thinking about reporting, things I don't see very often. Number of samples by zone, number of samples by strata, tables of simple information, number of exceedences. Even the CIEH stats very rarely see that. Engineering obs hardly ever see that. All these things that help inform the report that are not really in guidance per se, but I would say a good practice, they're just hard to do. And they're really hard if I've got to go to the back of the report and try and find them. So I can't do that. But it'd be nice if you guys can help. So how adequate is your investigation? Sampling, basically the bit I always look at. There is some other stuff, I'll go to it now. Anyone ever read P5066? Brilliant piece of guidance, Mary Harris wrote it. Anyone read it? The New Zealanders reproduced pictures from it, they think it's that good. CLR4, also pretty good. There's little algorithms in there about hotspot analysis. So when you're doing unbiased sampling, you're actually doing a calculated guess as to how big a hotspot you might hit. And it's the one thing I always look at. And there's a good little spreadsheet on the NZ sampling guidance that you can use for that. But, you know, I rarely do you get a serious listening to. Oh, this is just a little interesting case. This site was divided into two. And this was the sampling plan. The black dots were the validation proposals for the trial pit removals of localised hotspots in an area that the yellow bit's clean. I hated it. Absolutely, I just thought, oh God, it's probably right, and it's probably not an unacceptable risk, but it's just messy. So I said, put a 20-metre grid on it from British Standard, whatever, and do some extra sampling for me, and do some stats for me to show me that this bit is what you say it is, because I'm really not interested in digging out 8 ppm of BAP. I'm sort of interested in whether the bit as a whole is clean and how confident we are. And to my mind, a bit of dirtiness is just what you get. I won't make the joke about the wife. So you just, you just accept that you're going to get some bad results. Now, does digging them out make it any different? If you offset the same SI by 3 metres, would you just not get the same result again? Are we not looking at things in the round? So to do that, you do need some sort of tool. And I know the CIEH stats is a bit old hat, but it's the best we've got. So, this was a set of SI. I got another one. The data all came in on different maps. I did lose it. the consultant said, well, we have to look at it all together. And I'm going like, I'm not even looking at this in a PDF. I'm looking at it in a static, horrible document imaging system, which is laggy, it's unresponsive. I can't flick from one page to another. For God's sake, at least give me everything in one go. And in the end, we both said sorry to each other. He did it, put it all, so basically the different colours and the different symbols are different levels of site investigation that originally arrived in separate pieces. He then put them together, and I was still a bit messy, so I they've already identified the hotspots, which was probably right. But then I just said, well, again, just put a 20-metre grid on it. I mean, we're not even sampling at a 20-metre grid. We're going for centres here, so it's woefully substandard. But I have to say, from a personal point of view, I tend to think that a site investigation is either 1, 2 or 3 days, because it's all the market will bear. And if you've got enough information to sort of show your point, then you're all right. So, tips and tricks. Find the bits that work for you. Needless to say, I quite like sampling. And that hotspot calculation I was talking about can be quite useful, because you can throw it back to people and say, do you really think it's good enough to know that you've missed that you may or may not have found a hotspot the size of 3 or 4 people's gardens? I'm not absolutely sure that's good enough. There are 300 local authorities. We're all a bit different. You know, try and tell a good story, really, I think. You can't, I'm known for being quite risk happy. You know, I'm maybe, until I get me things tweaked a bit. You know, sites don't have to be clean. Not everybody is the same as me, but again, not everybody's looking for a fight. If you can tell the story well and explain yourself, I think most people ought to realise that you've got a difficult job to do. And, you know, at the end of the day, that person who divided that site into 2 wasn't a million miles off. It was just you needed some comfort that it was going to be okay. Your answers need to be clear and technically confident. And you know, you could, like Rachel said, you could even just pick up the phone. But please don't factually report odd things in a sentence. Because the people who you work for, you know, years ago, even if you're for the biggest company, you know, a big 4-letter acronym company, the directors in your company probably set it up and had their house on the line. If you're for a smaller company, their house is on the line. Their livelihood's on the line. So if you're burying things factually in a report, it may or may not be satisfactory, but it might unwind. I mean, I ended up on that petrol station job, for want of a better phrase, saying, I think it could be Part 2A. Can you imagine the world of pain we'd have all been in? It's not much fun. So peer review, you know, ask your colleagues to look at your reports. Make sure you've thought about the uncertainties, and if it's potentially very, very bad, then CSM. That's it.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite a humorous talk in parts. Next, I'd like to welcome Angela Haslem from the Environment Agency to the stage, who's going to talk about what the Environment Agency is doing in terms of developing some new guidance and stuff at the moment for the brownfield sector.
Thank you. It's not going to be as amusing, I'm afraid. And neither have I got any free copies of CLR 11 to hand out either. I just wanted to say thank you very much. I'd been a member of the Geological Society since the late 80s, which shows how old I am. So this is quite a pivotal moment to actually stand up here at the front. It's quite special. So thank you for the opportunity. My name's Angela Haslam. I am a senior advisor in the Environment Agency in a national team covering land and contamination management. And I was asked here today to just give a bit of an overview on what we're doing regarding developing guidance, in general improving standards for the land contamination and the brownfield sector, and really just from a regulatory perspective. I have to qualify this by saying that I've been in this national role for about 6 months now, having been in a an area groundwater contaminated land team for about 15 years, worked for the Environment Agency for 20 years, so fairly new to this national perspective. So please bear with me. It came with quite a very long to-do list when I arrived into the post. There'd been a period of time where there'd not been necessarily people in this role. So I'm just kind of finding my way at the moment. So I tried to keep things simple. It is Tuesday afternoon. You've been here, well, some of you will have been here for nearly 2 days. So I just wanted to touch on the guidance, give you a bit of an update on what's happening, future direction. I do want to speak about the NQMS, and for people who don't know what that stands for, I apologise now if you've already heard all this before. I only arrived at lunchtime, so that's the National Quality Mark Scheme for Land Contamination Management. Obviously an industry initiative. I would like to spend some time just considering the significance of that development. And then actually I also wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of what we're doing internally to endeavour promoting our own professional development for our own officers to give a balanced approach to the playing field, such that not only are we expecting standards to be high from industry, equally, I think it's fair for you to expect when we do review your reports that internally our own standards, you know, we have chartered officers or we have officers in preparation for chartership, so that it's, you know, we're promoting and we're practicing what we preach. So give you a little bit of an update on that, and then this is 2017, and I know I sat through the workshop session on CONSIM, and it was very clear that the message was that the direction of travel for guidance in the future is very much industry led in terms of that collaboration with ourselves. Providing more of a steer as opposed to having an infinite amount of resource to churn out considerable quantities of guidance going forward. We did reflect on the fact that, you know, 20 years ago we had the National Groundwater Contaminated Land Centre, you know, and a lot of money to be able to devote to development of guidance, and things have changed over the years. So I included this slide because this is one of the most recent publications that I think it was about March this year, and it's the petroleum hydrocarbons in groundwater. The focus is on providing guidance for existing risk assessment for groundwater. And I just thought, given the flavour of the conference, it was appropriate, in case nobody had noticed that this had appeared on the Clare website. It was very well publicised, but it is a fantastic example of a document that, for all intents and purposes, did sit around for a long number of years, and has actually now made it out into the wider environment. And I hope it's of value to people to be able to use this and to benefit from the information inside this document. And it is a document that a number of industry representatives, so we've got, I don't know whether you can see this actually, but the SOBRA, REMSOC, SAGTA, EIC, the Environment Industries Commission, and the Environment Agency supported it from a steering perspective. So it isn't badged by the Environment Agency, but we were and are very supportive of the content of it. So I think I just wanted to give you a flavour of perhaps what you might be looking to expect going forward with some of either new guidance or existing guidance that needs to be refreshed or updated. A considerable amount of guidance has been around for a long time and is showing its age in terms of needing a bit of a refresh and an update. So because I'm new into this role, there's a long list of things that do need attention, and it's looking at opportunities and ways in which we can work with industry where it's appropriate to develop and update and refresh documentation so that everybody can benefit. And, you know, we're not talking about a new industry, we're talking about an industry that has evolved and is more mature now than it was in the 90s when we were all desperate for guidance on X, Y and Z. So I think, you know, it is reflective of where we are as a sector and as regulators as well, a considerable amount of experience across local authorities and the Environment Agency and NRW. So I thought it would be important just to sort of, you know, highlight the existence of this document but just show what can be achieved if we all work together, and the direction of travel in some respects that we might be taking going forward. So, CLR 11, model procedures for the management of land contamination, been around for a considerable amount of time. Somebody actually had a hard copy earlier, which somebody in the room's walked away with, I think. Very lucky. You know, those were the golden days, weren't they, when we had hard copies of documentation and guidance. I'm conscious that at the moment, because we've lost the website that the Environment Agency had, and we've moved over to gov.uk, there are a considerable number of items that are not easily findable on gov.uk or are missing completely. We do have some information on CLR 11 on gov.uk, but I think there's a general feeling that it's such a significant and important piece of our framework and our history. You know, it's the established approach by industry that, you know, really there ought to be more of CLR 11 visible on gov.uk. The general premise is now that we don't clog up gov.uk with good practice. We are constrained by the way in which we are able to publish to gov.uk. It's very much about what do I need to do? You know, what do I need to do to get a driving licence? What do I need to do to get a passport? What do I need to do to do a risk assessment? And unfortunately, it is quite difficult to shoehorn quite a lot of what we're used to writing and the way in which we're used to writing the guidance into that way of publishing. So it is going to be a challenge. And I think at the moment we're considering how much of CLR 11 we can actually get onto gov.uk. PDFs are out of the question. They're not keen on PDFs, so it will be a challenge. But I hope to be able to come back at some point in the future and be able to say to you, gov.uk is now fully reflective of the contents of CLR 11, and it's not just a link to another website with, you know, sort of potentially appendices to that document that are slightly out of date. So, you know, I don't want anybody to leave the room today to think, they're rewriting CLR 11. We're not. We're just revisiting and trying to see how much of that we can get onto gov.uk such that it provides that overarching methodology that we're all used to having, so that, you know, people who are new to the game, people who are interested and need to know what the structure is and need to understand how to do things are able to access that information. Something else that I realised, we tend to get quite a lot of questions about where is so-and-so on the website, was the remediation position statements that I think people may well have been used to accessing previously. Again, not visible on gov.uk. So again, it's something that I will be looking at to try and make sure that there is visibility about the nature of the permitting requirements for remedial technologies and any regulatory position statements that are required are there and visible on gov.uk. So it's work in progress. Can't tell you when it'll be up there or when it'll be rectified, but it's on the agenda to revisit some of these things. Guiding principles for land contamination. Is that something that people still refer to? Can I have a show of hands if people are regularly clicking on that document on gov.uk? I think there's only the second one. Anybody using it? Anybody used it previously when it was 3 documents? Checklists? No? So, at the moment, the guiding principles for land contamination, whilst there aren't many people in the room that are actively using this document, there is a move to try and see if we can work with industry to broaden the content of the guiding principles and potentially bring it to work with the nuclear decommissioning sector and try and broaden that document so that it has a wider application. It was very much written from the perspective of the Environment Agency and what we needed you to do for water and waste related issues. It has huge potential for it to turn into something much more useful. And that, again, is something that we're working quite closely with the Land Forum and SAGTA to consider how we might take that forward and how we might modernise it and how we might broaden it. So that's something to, you know, in 12 months' time, I might be able to stand here and tell you this is what we've achieved, similar to the TPH hydrocarbon document. And I do get quite a lot of requests for guidance related to, particularly for Part 2A, on significance of pollution. So again, that is something that has been sort of on the sidelines, been in abeyance, awaiting changes to the hazardous substances reviews that have gone on earlier this year. So hopefully that is something that we might be able to revisit in the short term. So I hope that just gives you a little bit of a flavour. In terms of gov.uk, I thought I'd just put this up because we do have the Land Contamination Management landing page, and from this you will then be able to navigate through to a fairly limited amount of information, and then there will be links to the Clare website, the Clare Wall Water and Land Library, where some of the historical documents are currently available. I've included a link to the open data. I don't know how many people actively use the open data links on gov.uk. If you want to be nosy and find out where all the money went for the Land Contamination Capital Programme, there's a link there to how much local authorities received over the years, and also the information available externally on the contaminated land special sites. There's a whole host of other freely available information, and I'm just not sure that a lot of it is either known or people realise how much open data there is actually on gov.uk. Those are just two selected examples because it's what interests me most, but if you have the opportunity, it's worth having a poke around on open data. And I think you'll be amazed as to how much information is actually available without having to put in requests for information to us. It's well worth just go in and have a look and see what you can find. I wanted to mention I have mentioned the Clare's Water and Land Library. There's a link there. Hopefully the slides will be shared later. And obviously there's also a similar arrangement on Syria's Contaminated Land Guidance tool. So I wanted to make sure that, there is an array of opportunities for you to find out quite a lot of information relating to current or historical guidance, and also particularly the Clare Wall website is up to date because of the NQMS system that is supporting directly through CLR 11. That brings me tidily onto the NQMS. So if nobody does know a lot about NQMS, it was launched in January this year. It was an industry initiative that was brought forward by the Land Forum. We've actively supported, as the Environment Agency, the introduction of the NQMS. And I think if you go onto the actual Clare NQMS website page, there's a copy of our position statement and also a copy of our Chief Executive's supporting letter. Clare as an organisation are the scheme administrator, and the little logo that you can see there is the idea being that any documentation that's been through the NQMS and is certified, that's the logo that the relevant person who's suitably qualified and experienced is able to endorse documents with. So at a glance, it's obvious whether a document or a report has been produced through the NQMS. I've included a link to the details on the Clare website. There is a really, really useful overview document. It's about 30 pages. It's well worth a read. I read it on the train again, coming down. So it's the sort of thing that is a reference document. It's really handy just to, sort of refresh your knowledge as to the objectives, how it works. I've lifted some of this straight from that document, actually. So you'll see the term suitably qualified person. Should be suitably qualified and experienced person, because these people are chartered by definition. So you'll see the term SQP. And at the moment, they are examined and appointed by the Land Forum, by the Land Forum as an SQP via the SQP provider, which is at the moment is Silk. So obviously they administer the Silk scheme, so there's a conversion for existing Silks to move on to become a suitably qualified person under the NQMS. I think it's a digital examination. So the purpose of the SQP, And I think this is what's really important, is that in times of challenging financial situations and limited resources, the purpose of the SQP really is to provide that critical review. Effectively, in some respects, adopting that sort of regulatory perspective, looking at reports, making sure that the team that have worked on a particular project are the right people, have the right qualities, are professionally qualified to do the individual bits of work. There's no expectation that the SQP will do all of the work, but they are the person putting their name to the actual declaration at the end. So it's their professional standing, it's their chartership that's potentially at risk in the future if they're signing off reports that ultimately appear to be below the standard necessary. I've referred to the term declaration. It's very similar to the existing practice for the definition of waste, code of practice, where a formal declaration is made via the Clare website. A small fee is required to actually buy the declaration. That's really just to cover the administrative costs of running the website and keeping the wall, land and water library up to date that supports their technical, so the ability of the SQP to keep up to date with legislation and guidance. And ultimately, the idea being that the report and the declaration are submitted for regulatory purposes. That could be to your local environmental health officer, or it could be to the Environment Agency, depending on whether it's for a planning application or in support of a planning application. I've said here that originally it was mainly aimed at the planning system, and yet everyone, I think, can see the purpose and the value of why that might be, to raise standards for factual and interpretive information, for land contamination assessments. Equally, it could be used for Part 2A, and I think as the fact that we have a limited budget this year for further investigations for Part 2A for potential special sites and special sites, as part of our procurement procedures, we're looking at seeing if we can make sure that any of our successful consultants are following the NQMS scheme. Seems appropriate to practice what you preach. It's fine us telling people to consider using the scheme and how great it is, and then go off and procure consultants and not require that level of scrutiny. So like I say, it's early days, but it seems quite useful. Under the environmental permitting regulations for compliance and baseline reporting for industrial emissions directive purposes, anybody wanting to do some sampling and some reporting and setting some standards on industrial sites, there's no reason why the NQMS system can't be applied to any of the reports submitted for the purposes of permitting. Equally, there's no reason why the NQMS can't be used for any documentation supporting any investigation, risk assessment, remediation for pollution incidents. And again, I'm trying to influence internally to make sure that our teams are aware of the NQMS, and in terms of even our own contractors, even when we go in and we do the work ourselves, making sure that there's awareness of the benefits that could be achieved by using NQMS certified contractors. And equally, there's no reason why it couldn't be used for enforcement activities where necessary. I've included just a little list of the types of documents that, or the types of work that the NQMS could be used. Normal procedures, desk studies, risk assessment, site investigation, options appraisal, verification reports, monitoring. The purpose of the NQMS is to provide a declaration for each individual report, which when I first started, I wasn't entirely convinced that was, well, I wasn't sure that was the case at all, but it became apparent that it is a declaration for each individual report. So I think my next slide, when I last checked, I think there were 17 declarations that have been purchased at the moment. It might have changed in the last few days. So it is quite a slow burn, but you can see why on some big projects where these are phased investigations or phased developments, that it will take time for individual components of that array of documentation for it actually to come in for regulatory purposes or be utilised in that way. So whilst the number's small, the number of SQPs that are qualified is considerably higher, but I don't necessarily think that's because there's a problem with the scheme or that it's slow uptake. I think it may well be that it's just necessarily reflective of the way in which the work gets done and the way in which projects evolve. And it is early days. It was only January, and it's November now, it's not even, well, it's short of a year, and I'm sure there are a lot of people looking and seeing and waiting to see how this will develop. So the idea behind the NQMS was that it might result in fewer delays, the information might be more readily acceptable for regulatory purposes. Excuse me. Obviously, it's looking to improve the quality of the information that's submitted, and wants to avoid enforcement action in the future where substandard information has been used. And there seems to be a sort of a message about getting it right first time. It's important that we gain confidence in the quality of these reports, and that should give some assurance to the people commissioning them, but equally reassurance to regulators who are on the receiving end, and particularly in times of austerity, where a lot of this scrutiny and checking by suitably, qualified people and experienced people, this should, with an NQMS certification, give a little bit more reassurance that the checking has been done and that what we're looking at is appropriate for the purposes to which it was commissioned. Ultimately, everybody hopes it speeds things up. We'll have to wait and see whether it results in the potential savings to both public and private sector, which I think it has real opportunity if we give it a chance and we support it and we encourage it and we talk to people about it to see whether it's appropriate for various projects and just see whether it can deliver on these promises. It is an industry initiative. These were the things that they set out to achieve, which are important to everyone in this room. Makes everyone's life easier if this goes well. So clearly the scheme's new. Confidence is a big issue. Can we realistically expect what we see with the quality mark to deliver what it says on the tin? Until we start to look and have a sort of a review of the reports that come through the system. We're not able to say at the moment because, like I say, few actual reports have come in for regulatory review. There is going to be a formal auditing process. I think in the overview document there's an expectation that Claire itself as administrator will do an annual audit. We're not there yet. And it would make sense, wouldn't it, to have, it's a bit like shopping at Tesco with your trolley and your self-scan, isn't it? You worry whether or not you're going to be the trolley that gets pulled over to the side to be checked. That's what the auditing process is about. It's not just trying to find the people that are sort of trying to get under the radar, but equally there's opportunity to actually make some real changes to the scheme, to see what isn't working, what is working well, can we change it for the better. And internally, we'll also look at any reports that are submitted to us within the first 12 to 18 months potentially, to just see whether or not it is actually delivering what we expect it to, and are the benefits that the scheme clearly set out to achieve are actually being realised. And then we'll work with Claire as the administrator and the Land Forum to try and make any improvements necessary. I sit on the steering group for NQMS, so we've only had 2 meetings so far. But clearly the next step is going to be, how's it going? What are these documents like? Are they delivering the benefits? Are they actually up to scratch in terms of, technical competence and technical scrutiny? And are they reliable? Are they delivering the outcomes that the scheme actually set out to achieve? So that's enough from me on NQMS. I thought it was important in case it hadn't been mentioned in any detail. Apologies if it has, but it is quite an important time in our history in terms of developing an initiative like this. I said at the beginning, I also wanted to sort of say we do practice what we preach in terms of trying to raise standards. And I'm pleased to say that in the last sort of 6 months, we've worked internally to, we've always had a practicing geologist scheme inside the Environment Agency. It is endorsed by the Geological Society, which is why I mention it today, and CIWM. It's been around since about 2010, 2011, I think. It is based on achieving capabilities that are set out in our area groundwater contaminated land technical development frameworks. And again, the frameworks themselves are endorsed by the Geological Society and CIWM. it's not just about geologists, it is about the opportunity to use this route as a stepping stone for early careers professionals in the Environment Agency to be able to go for chartered scientists if they don't have a strong geological background, or obviously to go for chartered geologist with a view to helping them on that route. Some people will go straight to chartership, I'm sure, some depending on their experience and whether or not they've come in from other companies. But I just thought it was important to just sort of reassure people in the room that not only are industry doing their bit, but equally from a regulatory perspective, I think it's important that people are reassured when they do submit a report to us that it is being looked at by somebody who is being assessed as for their competence, for their skills and for their credibility professionally. And professionalism within the geoscience in particular is an important aspect that we're promoting at the moment internally. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. And finally, I was asked by my colleagues that we are moving forward and we have a Twitter account, apparently. I'm too old for this, but I think it's literally been launched within the last 5 days, something like that. So beautiful strapline. At Geoscience EA, so anybody here who's young enough to have a Twitter account and is interested, because I'm not, but if I would just encourage everybody to have a look at this and just see some of the great work that the area teams are actually involved in when they're enjoying themselves and not arguing with you. And if you want to retweet it, and or if you, I don't even understand this, apparently you can like it. So I don't know, I had to create a Twitter account to like it, so it confused me. But so yes, I just wanted to end on a bit of a positive note, and that we are moving with the times, and all these young people are bringing all these incredible initiatives into the arena. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Next, it's Mike Smith, who's going to talk about some international and British standards that's being developed.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm talking about standards, and it's the technical standards. It's not the standard we have to achieve for remediation. We're not allowed to talk about numbers in ISO, and it's not really about the quality of what we have to do in remediation or so. But it's the technical standards that really underpin everything else that we do. Is how we get to the quality that we need. And first, just to make this distinction between the standard specifications and the codes of practice and the guidance documents. The difference being in the language. Shall is the key word for the standard spec. It's very easy. You've either done what it says or you haven't done what it says. You must follow the standard to the letter. When we get the codes of practice and guidance document, we have should. And it allows you wriggle room to decide what you're actually going to do. It's guidance. And it places the onus on the user. And if we just look at BS 10175, yeah, you want to follow it, but it doesn't protect you, it doesn't give you any immunity. It describes good practice rather than best practice. But of course, what is best practice now becomes good practice. So, if you like, the people writing a code of practice will try to make it as near to best practice as possible, but things change. But it means that if you can do it better, if you think you know there's a better way of doing it, the code isn't going to stop you from following your best technical expertise. You're not obliged to use it unless it's under contract or a planning condition. But of course, if you don't use it, the first thing in court will be, have you followed the guidance? so it can be used as in a case of negligence. It is to be used with professional judgment. And, you know, if you follow it, it doesn't absolve you from doing the good job. It's no good turning round and saying, well, I followed the code and it told me to do this. Because the question you then get is, of course, well, surely you use your other knowledge to decide what to do. And if you do deviate, well, from it, you have to be prepared to stand up in court and say why you knew better than the people that wrote the code. So you can do what you like, but if you build this building to a code of practice and then you ignore the code of practice, the structural codes, and it falls down, then you have to do it. Now, the benefits, everybody's working to the same guidance, so you get a level playing field. It is a way of being sure that things get done right, and it's a basis for structured training because it gives you an agenda that you can follow. And you can use it, you've got common standards across the whole of Europe and across the world, so people can go to work everywhere. You get a level playing field in tendering, hopefully, provided the spec in the first place actually asks people to comply with BS 10175 or whatever the code is. If the person writing the specification doesn't know what they're doing, then obviously they're not going to write the right spec. And the key document for Contaminated is BS 10175, and really a lot of what I'm going to say is going to centre around BS 10175. Now, you know, we produce standards. It's an open process, as open as we can make it. The problem is communication. Anybody can comment on the draft, but one of the problems is how do you get people to know that the draft exists? They are subject to regular revision. There's a review every 5 years. We have over 100 ISO standards on contaminated land, so there's always a strong temptation to simply say, renew it. It's not very tempting to say it needs revision. It is voluntary in terms of organisations that take part and then the individuals, and nobody gets paid. Very occasionally, BSI or someone will find some money to produce, do the heavy lifting, but it's extremely rare. BSI contribution towards travel costs goes down and down, and travel to Europe has gone down by over 20% this year. Add inflation to that, add a falling pound, and you're not going to even cover your, I have to say, it's very hard to cover your travel costs unless there is another source of funding. Everything, really almost everything now is at international or European level. The preference is international, and the second preference is European, simply because we want to do it once, do it right, and then Europe can adopt the ISO standard. Otherwise, you end up doing everything 2 or 3 times. Now, every country is finding it hard to get experts. And for the same reasons that we have, it's about the willingness of organisations to release people, it's about funding, it's getting authorities to see that it's worthwhile. Some other countries are better than often we are. The German Standards Organisation is better funded by the Environment Ministry. DEFRA doesn't fund anything here, of course. And the thing that I touched on before is the business of consultation. You know, if there is a standard out there and you're saying you haven't heard about it, well, you know, okay, BSI has failed to communicate, but then so have all the organisations represented on the BSI committees. Now, this diagram is meant to show the situation that we're in and the various committees at CEN, the European level, and ISO TC 190 is the top, and in effect, EH4, the BSI committee, is a shadow. It shadows the international standard, although obviously we do some projects in the UK, like 8.85, and then there are other hierarchy of committees. The thing that's in the difficulty that we now have is this committee, CEN TC 4444, which is responsible for producing environmental standards for solids. This is a EU Commission sort of push to reduce the number of standards, but they then try to have one analytical standard which covers soils, waste, sludges, bio-waste, and it's actually a nightmare. And the UK has resisted it all along, but we haven't won out. And we have CEN 292, which is responsible for waste, and so in effect EH4, which is the Soils Committee, is now also responsible for analytical and test methods for waste, for which we really don't have the expertise. So life has got more complicated. And we find it very hard among the people active to, if you like, send people to these various groups. Now, I said at the beginning, you know, this to talk about the history of BS 10175. And it goes back to 1976 when the Greater London Council produced a bulletin that covered everything you needed to know about contaminated land, really. It had risk assessment, it had trigger concentrations for cadmium and lead that were produced by a risk-based model in each case, an appropriate one, and it told you how to do site investigation. And now it's 40 years on. The GLC document really set the framework. It's what ICL took on board when we started, well, I started writing guidance documents on landfill sites and so on. So we really, after 40 years, we know what we should be doing. But we still have problems, of course, actually doing it or getting the quality right. We know what to do. There's no excuse, really, for saying that we don't know what we have to do. There was this unpublished one, which I just flagged up. It's not very important. It's 1981. We had a draft standard. All these public bodies had contributed. There wasn't a private sector at the time, just about 3 contractors working for GLC who knew what they were doing. And the Department of Environment said, we don't like it. And we never got anything more out of Department of Environment. But the moment they said that, it killed the project. And then you waited for DD 175 in 1988. And the other one, which is in there, is the Syria SP 103, which was actually the first document that talked about quantified risk assessment and actually set up the terminology and stuff that comes through in CLR 11 and so on. So it was an important step on the road to what we do. Now, BS 10175 sits inside this constellation of other supporting standards. We have the geotechnical ones, 5930, and all the European and other test methods that support it, 567, groundwater and surface water, 8576, ground gas. 8485 is really not an investigation standard, of course, although it does actually have guidance in on there about what is good practice before you do your assessment. And then we have all the ISO standards covering all these different topics: terminology, sampling, site assessment, analysis and testing of biological tests. And as I said, there are over 100 of these standards. And obviously finding your way around them could be quite difficult. I've put up the standard on sustainable remediation, which Paul Nathaniel has produced with really diligent work. It really is an international standard. He's had people in Australia, Canada, the US, and that contributing to that. But it shows you a bit of the problem that we have, because although he was the convener for the working group, BSI would not provide him with any secretarial support. And in the end, it was the German standards body that actually ran the working group. And then there are some other ones which are related to it. Now, you know, in the earlier presentation, somebody said, can I afford £120 for standard? We have done our best to persuade BSI to offer the standards at a discounted rate to regulators, which includes the Environment Agency, who are very hard up, of course. But they cost money. you know, BSI has to survive. With any money it gets from government, which is very little, is going down all the time. And the most of the money it gets from government is for travel. As I say, we've had major budget cuts for our travel funds this year. Now, the importance about those documents is that some of them are normative in BS 10175, which means that it is assumed that when you use BS 10175, you will follow the guidance in the other documents where it's appropriate. And so, in effect, if you like, you can be tested in court as to whether you have, in fact, really followed all the guidance that's in BS 10175. Some of them are just listed as informative documents, so there's no mandate that you should lose them. But it is important to recognise the status. And perhaps if you're doing a quality audit on ISO 9000, you would look at somebody's bookshelf and ask, where are these documents? Now, the thing about the 18400 series is that they are not just about contaminated sites, nor is EH4, nor is TC190 at ISO level. It's about soil quality across the whole range. So, yeah, contaminated sites, agricultural sites, natural sites, wooded sites. With the guidance is meant to cover the whole range. That does, of course, make them a bit more complicated than they might otherwise be if they just concentrated on contaminated sites. Now, we published a whole set of them in April. 204 overlaps 8576. In fact, 8576 was written originally as a sort of precursor for the ISO standard. And it was a way of getting it written in the UK. So we stick with 8576, but the two documents are compatible, and there's chunks of text from 8576 in 204. But we're still waiting for some to come. And unfortunately, some of these, 202, 203, have been with the German Standards Organization now for 15 months, and they just haven't made it to ISO. We have the strategies document, and we have the one on near natural and agricultural sites, and then one on sampling aerobic purposes. Now, of these, 104 is really the most important strategies document. But I'll come back to it in a moment. There are all these other documents which go under the title of soil and site assessment. These standards of soil, they're not about groundwater, although it's now, I think they'll be renaming the subcommittee as impacts, or soil impacts or something. And we have this, and they're guidance documents, and they are very useful. Some of them are in the process of being revision. Not all of them have been adopted as British standards, but they probably will be as they get revised. We had after lunch, we had a discussion on CONSIM and models for sort of predicting contaminants into groundwater, which is covered by 15175, which is a British standard. Now, we actually, at the comment stage, there were some good UK comments, and they went forward. But apart from the fact that we didn't go to Seoul meeting in South Korea at the end of September, the two of us that were going, or three of us, for fairly obvious reasons, I would have been at the working group talking about these models, and I am not an expert. I have the knowledge, I have the awareness, but in effect the UK is not doesn't have an expert, a real expert, if you like, making an input to that standard. And it's going through to the next stage. And we do suffer all the time. Can we find somebody who is able or willing to make a real input, who could have put in the knowledge about CONSIM? It does actually, I think it refers to CONSIM probably as an example, and it's drawn on some of the Environment Agency stuff, or it certainly did at one stage. but we're not making that expert input that we should be. And the other one on the list that I will mention is conceptual site models. A lot of talk here about conceptual site models and what they are. Again, a lot of input from the UK. Sometimes you send something out for comment, you get nothing. Another time you get back a lot. And we got a good response of conceptual site models. We have a meeting on Thursday in Hanover to try to sort out the comments, because as you can imagine, they're quite complicated and overlapping and so on. It's a French-led project. I think it's a useful document, but I will just say one thing about it. One is we try to emphasize the picture is not the model. The picture you draw is simply an expression of the model. The model is in your head. It's an imagining of what the site is like. And also, your conceptual site model doesn't start when you go on and start doing a desk study. The moment somebody says to you, would you investigate this gasworks site, this hospital site, this landfill, you have a conceptual model in your head. That's when it starts. So hopefully it will be a useful document. Now, I'll go to 104. I don't want to go into details. This is the scope, what you might want to know. It says that soils are complicated things. It's not simple. They're made up of all sorts of different phases, animals, roots, particles, and yet you're trying to get a representative sample that is relevant to your task in hand, and we never, very rarely, would we look at what is in a discrete particle. Maybe if you've got a radioactive particle, you want to know where the radioactivity actually is, but usually you would not consider the particle as such. And another general statement is, where is the substance of interest? Because that will affect, really, it should be borne in mind when you're taking your sample, when you're going to do your risk assessment. What is the relevant phase? Is it the fraction, very fine fraction? Is it going to leach because it's on the surface? In the case of soil moisture, if you're looking at phenol, it's soluble. The concentration in the soil, in the moisture in the soil, could be an order of magnitude greater than is in the soil. So if you look at the generic assessment criteria level, say for an industrial site for phenol, I wouldn't want to put that in my hand in there, because of the moisture would be, the phenol concentration could potentially take the skin off your hand, or certainly wouldn't do you any good. And that's a problem with risk assessment. We only look at chronic risks. So what the document does is, actually it says engage the brain. It's not a prescriptive document. Engage the brain, think what your objectives are, then design a strategy that will meet those objectives, taking into account this, and this. Certainly there are people on the drafting working group would like something more prescriptive, because they say that if you don't, I know this, you know that, this thing, if you don't know it, you shouldn't be doing the site investigation. You shouldn't have to tell people who are doing this work what are basic things, like soil is a highly variable and complex thing. But anyway, I don't think it will now be out until the end of next year. Things are so delayed. But it is a complex document. It takes into it some of the Environment Agency documents, CLR4, and some other stuff has been taken into it, if only in informative annexes. And one of the interesting things about BS 175, and it's a general comment, is we do need feedback. And earlier on in the meeting, somebody was talking to me about groundwater and problems with the guidance in BS 175. We do need feedback. And it's interesting, there's a whole annex missing from BS 10175. At one point it says, see Annex so-and-so, and it's the matrix of land use versus likely contaminants taken from CLR7 or one of the documents. And it's not in BS 10175. Nobody's ever complained. but it's now in it will be in 18400 202, the guidance on preliminary investigations. So we have sort of filled in the gap. Now, going back to the process, EH4, all these organisations on, I suppose I should have spelt them out in full to somebody who doesn't recognise all these initials. And then there are a few experts on there because they sit on as represent the UK on various experts. I said in case of Paul, Nathaniel, because he was convener for the working group on sustainable remediation. So we can, if you like, slot people in as experts if we can put them onto a working group somewhere. The theory is that the representatives of these organisations will get all the draft documents, they will tell the 1,000 people they represent they exist, they will consult them, and then they will offer comments. At least they will tell the people they represent the documents exist. But it doesn't work. Hardly any of these organisations have any mechanism, it would appear, for telling their members what is happening in EH4, or that there are draft documents. Hence, as most of you know, I do post information on the DISC mail group, which is sort of slightly bent in BSI procedures, but you're all members of one of these organisations, so it's due. And we've just had, missing on here, CEH, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, has today said they'll join in as well. But it doesn't work in the way that it should. And I don't know the way around that, really. The process is for British standards. We normally have a drafting panel, produce a draft, the parent committee approves the draft, it goes out for public comment, comments come in, we sentence the comments, decide, produce the draft and go on. ISO parallels it in the same way, except that, if you like, there are more stages. We have working drafts which only go out to the working group, committee drafts, DIS, and then the final DIS. And as I say, we have, and some will become out as European standards, and some will go direct to ISO. So the process is the same. And this just lists all the various stages. So it's a structured process. Now, very quickly about the pipeline, I've mentioned some of these. The ones in yellow should be published very shortly, or apart from the conceptual site models, which I said we're working on now. 15799 is out for comment. And then there's what's happening here. The Amendment 2 to BS 10115 is now being processed from BSI. It was really written to deal with 18400 series, and there's a bit about asbestos in terms of safety, not anything else, really, just safety. And what we've tried to do is to alter the text. If there isn't a clash with 18400, then the text hasn't been altered. In other places, chunks have been sort of removed, tables have been taken out, and you're told to go to the table in the other standard, and things like that. There's an Amendment 1 for 8485 is being considered, and it's all about the specification for the membrane, just to make it clearer as to what is wanted. I've said about the ISO standards in the pipeline, and two other ones. Are we going to revise BS 10175? It's due for revision. You know, we've done 2 amendments. Now they need consolidating. We need to deal with things that people have told us about. And we have agreed to try to produce a standard for sampling soil for determination of VOCs. And the reason for doing that is the guidance that exists is buried in analytical standards or storage standard. We want to tell people how to apply those methods in the field, and we want to tell people how to handle the samples to make sure they get to the lab safely. I suspect there's very little VOC soil sampling that's being done according to the standard, despite the fact that BS 10115 points you in the right direction. And as I say, 10175, are we going to revise it? Is it needed? Is it wanted? Is there a customer base out there that wants it? How extensive does it have to be? How do we deal with asbestos? Can we integrate asbestos into the PS101 or do we need a standalone document? Are we ready to produce a standalone document? And of course, who's going to do the work? You know, it's no good you saying we want it unless somebody is other than the usual suspects are willing to put the effort into doing it. And just to wind up, TC190, I say sole quality. It's produced a lot of stuff, particularly on contaminated sites, analytical methods. It keeps considering what's our future, so it's doing climate change, so it's standards. Because you get these carbon footprint studies, and all the people doing them are using different analytical methods to measure the carbon in the soil. So you can't really compare the studies, and then they build great big castles and models on what is quite dodgy data. So that's one of the targets. And the other one is the sustainable use of soil, which of course is now a global issue. Even Michael Gove knows about sustainable use of soil. He helped to launch the Alliance of Sustainable Soil. President Hollande was very much into it, and that's why AFNOR, we think, are very active at the moment in TC190. We don't know about Macron, but these are the new themes. And then the next question, you know, really is, we do need involvement of people. We do need people to chase their representatives. And we do need people to replace, organisations replace the representatives. We're struggling to get someone from the Environment Agency, yet again, to come and sit on the committee, or at least receive papers and so on. And we can always slot experts in. Our problem is, how do you find an expert? We can ask the people sitting around the table in each full meeting. We can try to ask the organisations that are represented, or what we haven't done yet is to just advertise on the GISMAIL group and say, look, do you want to be involved in this working group? And there's no money for it. And occasionally, I have found the experts in universities by asking the convener in the Netherlands or Germany, can you suggest somebody who can do it? But, you know, it's not a closed activity. It's open. Okay, thank you.
Questions? If I could just invite Angela and Rachel and Rob up to the stage. I think we've got about 5 minutes for questions. We have gone over slightly, so we will have to cut them a little bit short, I'm afraid. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? Anyone? So I think that's to Mike. Sorry, I think that was a question to you on how are we supposed to keep up with all of these standards that are being produced?
Well, I mean, I do my best for GISMAIL to, if you're on the group, to publicise the drafts, and even drafts that we're not meant to circulate at that stage, and the published standards. I have to say, I don't always put everyone up. Sometimes my eyes glaze over with some of the analytical standards. And I don't think the analytical standards, unless we're reaching the right audience at the moment, to get people to comment on them. But, you know, I do my best, and fortunately, you know, it's really up to the organisations that are represented to do this. And unless people ask, what we're not allowed to do, we can say all the organisations are, but we can't publish a list of the representatives. Yeah, no, and you can't find it on the website.
Yeah, no, it wasn't actually a criticism of the work that you do, because I do receive the updates from what you post, as I understand. experience. I just don't see how that can be done. And I see loads of reports that say, oh, it's done in accordance with 10175, and you know full well that's a lie.
You have to mark it down to CPD.
I think we can.
That's not general practice then. If people generally within the industry are not actually, they may be saying they're doing it in accordance with the standard, but they're not. In terms of your liability in a court of law, that is not general practice. If everyone is in your position, no one's got a full set of standards. I mean, I come from a geotechnical side with the same problem with Eurocode and in the geotechnical industry. And the amount of information that you are supposed to have sat and read and inwardly acknowledged when every time you say, I've done this investigation according to BS 113 is enormous. So we've got exactly the same in the contaminated landfill. So don't despair because your defence in the court of law is as long as you perhaps haven't written, I've done it in accordance with the PS, but actually done it in accordance with general practice, is an acceptable defence against negligence. Well, discuss. I don't know. I'll throw it out there.
I think we might have to save that discussion for the coffee break, as it's that time, unfortunately. And I think if there are any further questions for some of our speakers, some of them will be around as well, and I'm sure they would love to have an opportunity to receive some of your questions during the coffee break as well. So thank you very much to our 4 keynotes.